You know, I probably hold the world record for the shortest tenure as a problem resident in a homeowners association, from model citizen to public enemy number one in about 6 weeks. But then again, I also probably hold the record for being the only resident to have an HOA president arrested by a federal tactical team on my front lawn, so it balances out. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you are not going to believe how completely insane this story gets. It started, as these things so often do, with a search for peace. After 20 years of a career that involved far too much travel, far too much stress, and seeing far too much of the less than savory side of human nature, I was done. All I wanted was a quiet house in a quiet subdivision, with a neatly manicured lawn and neighbors who argued about nothing more serious than whose turn it was to host the annual block party. I was a security consultant, which is a polite way of saying I specialized in identifying and neutralizing threats for corporations and, occasionally, government agencies. My job was to see the patterns, to anticipate the moves, to understand the psychology of people who don't play by the rules. It paid well, but it left me with a permanent case of low-grade hypervigilance. The house I found was perfect. A 2-story brick colonial in a neighborhood called Whispering Pines, which, despite the aspirational name, had very few pines and absolutely no whispering. It was, however, impeccably quiet. The lawns were green, the mailboxes were uniform, and there was a palpable sense of suburban tranquility. I signed the mountain of paperwork, including the leather-bound HOA covenant that felt thick enough to stop a small-caliber round, and moved in. For the first month it was bliss. I spent my days unpacking, setting up my home office and decompressing. I met a few neighbors. There was the young family across the street, the retired couple next door, and then there was Brenda. Brenda was the HOA president. I first encountered her on a Saturday morning while I was wrestling with a new sprinkler head. A pristine, white Range Rover Evoque, a car that always seems to be driven with an attitude of aggressive superiority, purred to a stop at my curb. The window slid down to reveal a woman who looked like she was sculpted from disapproval. She had a helmet of blonde hair that looked both expensive and flammable, sunglasses the size of dinner plates, and a mouth set in a permanent thin line of dissatisfaction. "Good morning," she said, and the words came out as if they were an accusation. "I'm Brenda Thompson, president of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association." I introduced myself, wiping grease from my hands onto a rag. "Just getting settled in," I offered with a neighborly smile. Her eyes, hidden behind the dark lenses, scanned my property with the critical precision of a building inspector looking for reasons to condemn. "I see that," she said, her gaze lingering on my garage door, which was open. Article 4, Section B of the Covenants. Garage doors are to remain closed at all times unless a vehicle is actively entering or exiting. I blinked. "I'm just working in here, grabbing tools." "The rules are the rules," she chirped, a smile not quite reaching her eyes. "They're what keep Whispering Pines so desirable. We all have to do our part." She then pointed a perfectly manicured finger towards my front porch. "And that welcome mat. The approved color palette is earth tones. That shade of blue is rather vibrant." I looked at the welcome mat. It was a standard navy blue mat that said, "Welcome." It seemed about as offensive as a golden retriever puppy. But I just nodded. "I'll look into it," I said, my tone carefully neutral. As she drove away, my next-door neighbor, a kindly retired history teacher named Arthur, shuffled over from his prize-winning rose bushes. He had a gentle face and eyes that had seen decades of neighborhood drama unfold. "That was your official welcome," he said with a wry smile. "Met the Queen, have you?" I chuckled. "Something like that. She seems thorough." Arthur leaned on his fence, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "Thorough is one word for it. Brenda runs this HOA like it's her personal fiefdom. Her husband got a big promotion a few years back, and she quit her job to dedicate herself full-time to the beautification and regulation of Whispering Pines. We've lost some good neighbors because of her." He told me stories. The family who was fined into moving because their basketball hoop was a non-approved shade of orange. The guy who was forced to tear out a $1,000 stone walkway because he hadn't submitted the quarry receipts for the stones to the Architectural Review Committee, which Brenda single-handedly controlled. It was a pattern of petty tyranny, all executed under the guise of maintaining property values. I filed the information away. My professional life had taught me to be a meticulous note-taker. Brenda went into a new file on my secure server, under local threats. It seemed laughable at the time, but old habits die hard. The real conflict, however, started a few weeks later. The capstone of my Quiet Life project was a state-of-the-art security system. Not just alarms, but a fully integrated network of high-definition, low-light cameras, motion sensors, and data security that was admittedly overkill for a suburban neighborhood. But it was my profession, and frankly, it was my hobby. It was also, for me, a prerequisite for feeling truly relaxed. The installation was discreet. The cameras were small, housed in casings that matched the trim of my house perfectly. You wouldn't notice them unless you were specifically looking for them. Brenda, it turned out, was always looking. I received an official letter a week after the installation was complete. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock with the HOA logo embossed in gold. It informed me that I was in violation of Article 7, Section D. No external modifications, including but not limited to antennae, satellite dishes, or other electronic apparatus, may be affixed to any residence without prior written approval from the Architectural Review Committee. The letter stated that I had 14 days to remove the unapproved surveillance equipment or face a fine of $100 per day. I read the covenant, all 200 pages of it. I'm a patient man, and I read contracts for a living. The section she cited was clearly intended to prevent people from bolting enormous 1980s-style satellite dishes to their roofs. My system was neither an antenna nor a satellite dish. Furthermore, state law explicitly protected a homeowner's right to install security devices for personal safety. I drafted a polite, professional reply. I quoted the relevant sections of the covenant back to her, cited the state statute that superseded the HOA's authority on this matter, and included a printout of the law itself. I concluded by stating that the system was non-negotiable, but I was happy to discuss the matter further if she had any legitimate concerns. I mailed the letter via certified mail, return receipt requested. Another old habit: always create a paper trail. Brenda's response was not a letter, it was a personal visit. The white Range Rover appeared at my curb again, this time in the evening. She didn't get out. She laid on the horn. One long, imperious blast. I walked outside, my patience already wearing thin. She rolled down the window, her face a mask of indignation. "I received your little letter," she spat. "Are you a lawyer now? Quoting laws at me?" "No," I said calmly. "But I can read, and the law is quite clear. My security system stays." Her face flushed a blotchy, angry red. "This is not how we do things here. You are a renter in this community, a temporary guest. No, wait, you bought. Even worse, you think you can just come in here and ignore the rules that everyone else has to live by?" She was pointing at me now, her finger jabbing the air. "This isn't some back alley slum. This is Whispering Pines. We have standards. That equipment makes it look like a halfway house." It lowers the tone. "My security system is for my safety," I repeated, my voice still level. "It is discreet, professionally installed, and perfectly legal. It is not up for debate." The look she gave me was pure venom. "We'll see about that," she hissed, and the window slid up with a pneumatic hiss, sealing her in her climate-controlled bubble of rage. She peeled away from the curb, leaving the scent of entitlement and expensive perfume hanging in the air. Arthur watched the whole exchange from his porch. As I walked back to my door, he just shook his head slowly. "You've poked the dragon," he murmured, loud enough for me to hear. "She can't stand being told no, especially not when someone is right." He was correct. I had not just poked the dragon, I had challenged its dominion. And I knew, with a certainty forged over years of dealing with irrational actors, that this was just the beginning. Brenda wasn't going to be satisfied with fines or angry letters anymore. She had been publicly defied, and her ego would demand a far more significant retaliation. That night, I upgraded Brenda's file on my server from local threat to active antagonist. I began a new phase of my project, a comprehensive threat assessment of one Brenda Thompson. It was time to stop being a quiet neighbor and start being a security consultant again. My professional life had taught me a fundamental truth. When you're dealing with an adversary who operates on emotion and ego, you must operate on data and logic. Brenda had made it personal. My response would be anything but. It was time to turn the full, dispassionate force of my tradecraft onto the Queen of Whispering Pines. The first phase was passive intelligence gathering. I started with open-source information, a deep dive into public records, social media, and local news archives. Brenda and her husband, a mid-level executive at a regional bank, maintained a carefully curated online presence. Photos from charity galas, golf tournaments at the country club, vacations to sterile-looking resorts. It was a portrait of manufactured upper-middle-class success. But public records told a more interesting story. I found a string of lawsuits against the HOA from former residents, all settled out of court, with non-disclosure agreements. There were property liens filed for unpaid fines that seemed wildly disproportionate to the alleged infractions. I also pulled the HOA's financials, which were publicly available if you knew where to look. As a nonprofit corporation, they had to file annual reports. I spent a weekend with a pot of coffee and their budgets from the last 5 years, the period coinciding with Brenda's presidency. I'm not a forensic accountant, but I've worked with enough of them to know what to look for. And the red flags were everywhere. The landscaping contract, for instance, had tripled in cost since Brenda took over, yet the company providing the service, Prestige Greenery LLC, was a brand new entity formed the same year she became president. Its registered agent was Brenda's maiden name, and the address was a P.O. box. The budget for community events had ballooned, with large, vaguely described payments to a company called Executive Event Solutions. A quick search revealed this company was owned by Brenda's sister. Then there were the legal fees, a staggering amount for a sleepy suburban HOA, all paid to the same law firm where Brenda's cousin was a junior partner. It was a classic, if somewhat clumsy, kickback and nepotism scheme. She wasn't just a power-tripping tyrant, she was using the HOA as her personal piggy bank, funding her family and friends with our dues under the guise of maintaining community standards. This was no longer about a welcome mat or security cameras. This was fraud. While the financial investigation was percolating, Brenda's harassment campaign kicked into high gear. The official violation notices started arriving weekly. My grass was allegedly a quarter-inch too high. A single weed, bravely sprouting near my driveway, was cited as a violation of the grounds maintenance clause. My garbage cans, placed on the curb at 7 p.m. the night before pickup, were in violation of the rule, stating they couldn't be out before 9 p.m. Each notice came with a new fine, which I cataloged and refused to pay, each time sending a certified letter back referencing my ongoing dispute over the initial illegitimate violation concerning my security system. It was suburban warfare by mail. She also tried to turn the neighborhood against me. During my evening walks, I noticed a change. Some neighbors who had previously been friendly would now offer only a curt nod and hurry inside. Arthur explained what was happening. Brenda was spreading rumors in her email newsletters and at her informal coffee clatches. She painted me as a hostile and secretive newcomer, someone with something to hide. Why else would he need all those cameras? She'd ask, her voice dripping with insinuation. What is he so afraid of? Or what is he trying to watch? She was a master of sowing suspicion. She hinted that I was a potential threat to the safety and character of their community. It was a textbook psychological operation designed to isolate the target, but I had a few allies. Arthur was steadfast. He saw Brenda for what she was and quietly fed me information. Another neighbor, a young woman who worked as a paralegal and had her own run-ins with Brenda over the color of her daughter's swing set, offered to help me sift through the legal jargon of the covenants. The support was small but crucial. It reminded me that I wasn't just fighting for myself, but for anyone who didn't have the time, resources, or disposition to stand up to a bully. The game changed when Brenda decided to escalate beyond paperwork and gossip. It happened on a Tuesday night. I was in my home office reviewing the HOA's tax filings when my security system pinged my phone. A proximity alert from the front door. I pulled up the live feed. 2 men stood on my porch, They were dressed in cheap-looking black uniforms with a generic patrol services patch on the shoulder. They looked less like professional security and more like extras from a low-budget action movie. One was tall and lanky, the other short and built like a fire hydrant. Neither looked comfortable. The taller one knocked on the door, a sharp, aggressive rap. I watched on my monitor, my heart rate calm, my mind clicking through possibilities. This was a new tactic. An attempt at direct intimidation. I let them knock again before answering through the intercom system. "Can I help you?" My voice was clear and amplified by the small speaker. They were startled. The short one stepped back, looking for the source of the voice. Yeah," the tall one stammered. "We're with, Community Patrol. We've had a complaint from the HOA about unauthorized modifications to this residence." I focused one of my high-resolution cameras on his face, zooming in. The image was crystal clear on my 4K monitor. "A complaint?" I asked. "What is the nature of this complaint?" "Look, buddy, we just need to come inside, inspect the property, and make sure everything is up to code," he said, his confidence returning. He reached for the doorknob. This was the line. "Let me be very clear," I said, my voice dropping to the register I used to use when things were about to get serious. "You are on private property. You have not identified yourselves with a legitimate agency. You have no warrant. You have no legal right to be here, and you certainly have no right to enter my home. I am recording this entire interaction in high-definition video and audio. If you touch that doorknob again, I will consider it an attempt at forcible entry. I am directing you to leave my property immediately. If you are not gone in 30 seconds, I will be calling the real police and reporting you for criminal trespass." I saw the bravado drain right out of them. They exchanged a nervous glance. The short one muttered something I couldn't quite hear. The tall one took a step back, holding his hands up. All right, man, geez. No need to get all bent out of shape. We're just doing our job. Your job, at this moment, appears to be criminal harassment at the behest of my HOA president," I replied flatly. "Your 30 seconds have started." They didn't wait for the countdown to finish. They practically tripped over each other, scrambling off my porch and scurrying back to a beat-up Ford Crown Victoria parked down the street, the quintessential wannabe cop car. They sped off into the night. I saved the video file, labeling it Attempted Intimidation, Exhibit A. I sat back in my chair, the adrenaline finally starting to register. This was a significant escalation. Brenda was no longer content with fines and whispers. She was now willing to hire thugs to impersonate authority figures and try to force their way into my home. She had crossed a bright red line from a civil dispute into active criminal conspiracy. The welcome mat, the grass, the garbage can had all been a prelude. Her ego, bruised by my refusal to bow, was now demanding a level of victory that the law and the HOA covenants could not provide her. She was improvising, and her improvisations were getting dangerous and sloppy. And that's when I knew she would try again. She would be humiliated that her rent-a-thugs had been so easily dispatched. Next time, she would want to make sure it worked. She would be more aggressive, more theatrical. She would want to see me publicly humiliated, dragged out of my house. And in that moment of clarity, sitting in the glow of my monitors, the entire endgame crystallized in my mind. She was going to hand me the means of her own destruction, and I was going to be ready to receive it. My quiet life was over, but a new, far more interesting project had just begun. Operation Whispering Justice. The encounter with the faux patrolman was the catalyst. It shifted my entire perspective. This was no longer a matter of defending my rights as a homeowner. It was a matter of proactive threat neutralization. Brenda had demonstrated a willingness to engage in criminal activity. My professional training screamed that when an adversary escalates to unlawful acts, you don't just build higher walls, you dismantle their capacity to attack. I had the financial records, the evidence of her campaign of harassment, and now a crystal-clear recording of her hired goons attempting to intimidate me. But it wasn't enough. To truly put a stop to this, I needed to catch her in an act so egregious, so undeniably criminal, that the consequences would be swift, severe, and public. I needed to let her build her own gallows. The first step was to secure my legal flank. I contacted a lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense attorney named David Chen who specialized in property law and, as I learned from our first meeting, had a particular dislike for overreaching HOAs. I laid out the entire story for him, presenting my evidence in a neatly organized digital folder: the letters, the fines, the annotated HOA financials, and the video of the patrolman. David leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This is remarkable," he said, looking at the screen. "This isn't just a case of an HOA president gone wild. You have evidence of potential wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy. This goes far beyond a simple civil suit." "I'm not interested in a civil suit," I told him. "That takes years. It's messy. Brenda thrives on mess and drama. I'm interested in a final resolution." "What do you have in mind?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. "I believe she's going to try something like this again," I explained. "But next time, it will be bigger, more dramatic. She wants to see me humiliated. I anticipate she'll hire people to impersonate actual police officers. She'll want me arrested." David's eyebrows shot up. "Impersonating a police officer is a felony, a serious one. Conspiring to do so in order to commit another crime, like unlawful entry or kidnapping. You're talking federal charges." "Exactly," I said. "And I want to be ready." This is where my past came into play. For 20 years, I had built a network of contacts in federal and state law enforcement. These were not casual acquaintances. They were people with whom I had shared high-stress situations, people who trusted my judgment. I made one phone call. My destination was a sterile office in the downtown federal building, a place I knew well. I was meeting with a man named Mark Evans, a deputy director at the FBI, and an old friend. Mark was a career agent, a man with a bulldog's tenacity and a deep-seated intolerance for corruption. I laid out the same file for him that I had for my lawyer. He listened intently, his expression growing more grim as I played the video of the fake patrolman. "So, these two clowns backed off pretty easily," Mark noted. "She'll learn from that. If your assessment is correct, the next crew she hires won't be so timid. They'll be more aggressive, more convincing." "That's my thinking," I agreed. "She's not going to stop. Her ego won't let her. She's going to double down." Mark steepled his fingers, his eyes fixed on some distant point as he processed the information. "You've got a compelling case for a pattern of criminal activity here. The financial stuff is the bread and butter of our white-collar division. But this impersonation angle, that's bold and dangerous. If she tries to stage a fake arrest, that's a potential kidnapping scenario." He looked at me directly. "What do you want from me, old friend?" "I want to set a trap," I said. "I want to let her play her hand, and I want you to be there to catch her when she does. We coordinate with local PD, set up a sting. My house is the stage. When she sends her team, we have a real team in place to welcome them." Mark was silent for a full minute. The gears were turning. A sting operation based on the anticipation of a crime is a complex undertaking. It requires probable cause, careful planning, and a mountain of approvals. But I had brought him more than just a theory. I had brought him a pattern of escalating behavior and hard evidence. "She's watching you," Mark said. More as a statement than a question. "Your house, your routine." "Constantly," I confirmed. "Her Range Rover is a regular feature on my street. My cameras log its position every time it passes." "Good," he said, a glint in his eye. "That's a key element for a conspiracy charge. She'll want a front-row seat to the show." The plan began to take shape over the next 2 weeks. It was a joint operation. Mark handled the federal side, securing the warrants and assembling a small elite team of plainclothes agents. He liaised with the local police department, bringing their chief into the loop. The chief, it turned out, was no fan of Brenda Thompson, having dealt with her incessant, frivolous 911 calls about parking violations and loud children for years. He was more than happy to commit his department's SWAT team to the operation. The official justification was a sting to apprehend a group suspected of conspiracy to commit kidnapping under the color of authority, backed by the evidence of the financial crimes. My home became the operational hub. A team of technicians, posing as electricians from a company I hired to upgrade my wiring, swept the house for any listening devices Brenda might have planted. There were none. She wasn't that sophisticated, and installed their own covert audio and video equipment. We had cameras covering every conceivable angle, inside and out. We even replaced my solid oak front door with a specially prepared one. It was still solid oak, but it was fitted with a magnetic lock system that I could control remotely. It would hold against a battering ram for a precious few seconds, but would also open instantly on my command. The waiting was the hardest part. I had to maintain my routine, acting the part of the beleaguered resident, patiently weathering the storm. I continued my evening walks, offering a polite but firm nod to Brenda whenever our paths crossed. I continued to send my certified letters responding to her violation notices. To her, I must have looked like a man slowly being worn down by bureaucracy. Little did she know, my house was now a fortress, and a team of federal agents and police officers were on standby, waiting for her to make her final, fatal mistake. The bait was set. We needed to give her a reason to act now. David, my lawyer, sent the HOA a final, blistering letter. It was a masterpiece of legal threat. It stated that if the campaign of harassment did not cease and desist immediately, and if all fines were not rescinded within 72 hours, we would be filing a massive civil lawsuit, backed by a forensic accountant's report on the HOA's finances. We attached a summary of the accountant's preliminary findings, just enough to show we had the goods on her financial shenanigans. We knew this would push her over the edge. A lawsuit meant discovery. Discovery meant subpoenas. And subpoenas meant her entire house of cards would come crashing down. She wouldn't be able to afford a long public legal battle. Her only option in her mind would be a swift, decisive strike to remove me, the source of her problem, from the board. She would need to discredit me so completely that no one would ever believe my claims. A dramatic arrest for some trumped-up, serious-sounding crime would be just the ticket. The 72-hour deadline was set to expire at 5 p.m. on a Friday. We anticipated she would act late that night or, more likely, in the pre-dawn hours of Saturday morning, a time when people are disoriented and official responses can be slower. The team went on high alert Thursday evening. The local SWAT team was staged at a nearby fire station. Mark's federal agents were in an unmarked van, a plumber's van, ironically parked a block away, with a live feed to all my cameras. I was at home, alone, acting as the cheese in the mousetrap. I sat in my office, watching the camera feed that covered the street. Friday came and went. The 5 p.m. deadline passed in silence. The evening was quiet. I went to bed around 11 p.m., as usual, though I knew sleep was impossible. I lay in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of the house, every nerve ending tingling with anticipation. The night was a long, slow crawl. 1 a.m. nothing. 2 a.m. a car passed. False alarm. 3 a.m. The world was utterly still. 4 a.m. My resolve started to waver. Had I miscalculated? Had her survival instinct finally overridden her ego? And then, at 4:48 a.m., it happened. My system pinged. A vehicle, a dark, unmarked van, had entered the cul-de-sac and parked 2 houses down. It had no commercial markings. It just sat there in the darkness, its engine off. A minute later, my street-facing camera picked up a familiar vehicle gliding silently to a stop at the far end of the block. A white Range Rover. She was here. She had come to watch her masterpiece unfold. The show was about to begin. The minutes between spotting Brenda's Range Rover and the arrival of her minions were the most electrically charged moments of my life. This was the culmination of weeks of planning, of psychological profiling, of turning my quiet suburban home into an elaborate stage for a federal sting operation. I sat in my darkened office, a single monitor illuminating my face, displaying a mosaic of camera angles. I saw the dark van, silent and menacing. I saw Brenda's car, a ghostly white shape under the faint glow of a distant streetlight. Inside that vehicle, I knew, was a woman giddy with the anticipation of her triumph. On my comm system, a small in-ear device, I heard the calm, clipped voice of Mark Evans from the command van. Target vehicle is stationary. She's in position. Team Alpha, confirm visual on the hostile van. A voice from the SWAT commander crackled in response. Visual confirmed. We have 4, possibly 5 individuals preparing to disembark. My own heart was a steady, rhythmic drum. The hypervigilance that had been a low-grade hum for years was now a finely tuned instrument. I wasn't scared, I was focused. This was my element. The script was written, I just had to play my part. At 5:03 a.m., the doors of the dark van slid open. 4 men emerged. This was not the B team from before. They were dressed in black tactical gear, complete with plate carriers, helmets, and what looked like rifles. They moved with a clumsy, exaggerated purpose, trying to mimic the disciplined formations they'd seen in movies. I zoomed in on one of them. The polish patch on his vest was crooked. His rifle was held awkwardly, with poor muzzle discipline. Amateurs, dangerous amateurs, but amateurs nonetheless. Mark's voice was calm in my ear. They're wearing Replica gear. Non-standard issue plate carriers. We've got them. Let them make their approach. On your go. The 4 men formed a loose stack near my front porch, moving with a swagger that was meant to project authority, but only screamed insecurity. I watched them on the monitor, a predator watching clumsy prey wander into the killing zone. One of them, a large, bearded man who was clearly the leader, stepped onto the porch. He held a small, cheap-looking battering ram. He didn't knock. He immediately began shouting, "FBI, open up, we have a warrant." The sheer audacity of it was almost comical. The Federal Bureau of Investigation doesn't typically announce itself by screaming at 5 a.m. with a shoddy battering ram. Local SWAT might, but these guys weren't local SWAT. I initiated the final phase of my protocol. With a silent keystroke, I started a full system recording on a separate, hardened server, while simultaneously live-streaming a private feed to my lawyer, David Chen, who was sitting in his own office, ready to act as a civilian witness. The bearded man shouted again, louder this time, "FBI, final warning, breaching." He and another man swung the ram clumsily at my front door. The sound was a dull thud, not the splintering crash they expected. The reinforced door and frame held firm. My custom magnetic locks were absorbing the impact. They looked at each other in confusion, then swung again. Thud. On the monitor showing Brenda's car, I could see the faint silhouette of her head leaning forward, craning to see the action. I could almost feel her frustration and impatience. "Do it," Mark's voice said in my ear. I took a deep breath. With a single click of my mouse, I disengaged the magnetic locks on the front door. On their third swing, the door flew open, and they stumbled inside, caught off balance by the sudden lack of resistance. They flooded into my foyer, rifles up, trying to look intimidating. The bearded leader took 2 steps in and froze. I was standing at the top of the main staircase, illuminated from behind by the soft light of the hallway. I wasn't cowering, I wasn't even armed. I was just standing there, in my pajamas, holding a coffee mug. I let the silence hang in the air for a second, allowing them to fully register the scene. The quiet house, the lone man who looked more disappointed than scared, confusion warred with aggression on their faces. The bearded man found his voice. "Get on the ground, hands behind your head, now." It was time. I raised my coffee mug in a mock toast. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice calm and clear, "I think you're in the wrong house." Then I gave the signal word into my comms, the word we had agreed upon. Whisper. The world exploded in controlled, professional chaos. The windows on EICE1. Their side of the foyer shattered inward as 2 flashbang grenades, deployed by the real SWAT team, detonated with blinding flashes and deafening reports. My uninvited guests were thrown into disarray, disoriented and stunned. Before they could even recover, the front door they had just breached was filled with the dark forms of real tactical officers. "Police, drop your weapons, get on the ground." The commands were not shouted with theatrical panic, but with the deafening, disciplined authority of professionals. There was no hesitation. The fake cops, blinded and deafened, dropped their mock weapons as if they were red-hot coals. Within seconds, all 4 were face down on my hardwood floor, being expertly handcuffed, their cheap tactical gear a pathetic contrast to the real thing. The entire takedown from breach to submission took less than 15 seconds. It was a symphony of violent efficiency. While the SWAT team cleared my house, a separate team of Mark's plainclothes agents, who had been positioned in the dark, descended on the white Range Rover at the end of the street. I walked over to my office window, which had a perfect view. The agents' cars boxed Brenda in front and back. I watched as 2 agents approached her driver's side window. They tapped on the glass. The window slid down. I couldn't hear the words, but I didn't need to. I saw the look on Brenda's face, illuminated by the flashing red and blue lights of the arriving marked patrol cars. It was a spectacular transformation. I saw the smug, victorious smirk melt away, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion. The confusion then morphed into dawning comprehension, and finally, into the cold, stark terror of someone whose entire world has just imploded. Her carefully constructed kingdom of petty rules and fraudulent contracts had been stormed, and its queen was being dethroned. The agent spoke to her for a moment, then she was asked to step out of the car. Her movements were stiff, robotic. They cuffed her, the real shiny steel cuffs a stark contrast to her expensive tennis bracelet. As they placed her in the back of an unmarked sedan, her head turned, and for a brief second, her eyes met mine across the lawn. The venom was gone. All I saw was pure, unadulterated shock. The dragon hadn't just been poked, it had been captured, caged, and was about to be rendered utterly extinct. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, clean light over whispering pines. It felt like the dawn of a new era. The aftermath was as swift and decisive as the raid itself. While Brenda and her 4 aspiring actors were being processed downtown, my house became a command center. The real police secured the scene, and David, my lawyer, arrived, looking like he'd won the lottery. He shook my hand, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and professional glee. "I have never, in my entire career," he said, "seen anything quite like this. You baited a federal case onto your doorstep." The news spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. The pre-dawn spectacle of flashing lights, a SWAT team, and the sight of their HOA president being led away in handcuffs was impossible to miss. By 8 a.m., my phone was buzzing with texts from Arthur and my paralegal neighbor. The neighborhood group chat, which Brenda had once ruled with an iron fist, was exploding with speculation and rumor. Brenda and her crew were charged with a laundry list of felonies. For the hired hands, it was conspiracy, breaking and entering, and impersonating federal officers. For Brenda, it was all that and more. Mark's team, armed with the evidence from my forensic accounting deep dive, added multiple counts of wire fraud and mail fraud to her rap sheet. Her carefully constructed empire of kickbacks and cronyism was now Exhibit B in a federal indictment. She made bail, a testament to her husband's savings, but the terms of her release were strict. She was forbidden from contacting anyone involved in the case, which included half the neighborhood, and was forced to surrender her passport. The white Range Rover was impounded as evidence, as it was used in the commission of a felony. Seeing her being picked up from the courthouse by her crestfallen husband in a modest sedan was a small, satisfying victory in itself. The real sea change happened at the emergency HOA meeting a week later. The community hall was packed. For the first time, there was no fear in the air, only anger and a sense of betrayal. The remaining members of the HOA board, Brenda's spineless enablers, sat at the head table looking pale and terrified. David and I attended. We didn't have to say much at first. The sight of me, the supposed neighborhood pariah, walking in with a high-powered attorney was enough to silence the room. David took the podium. He didn't grandstand. He simply and methodically laid out the facts. He presented a summary of the forensic accountant's report, showing the homeowners exactly where their money had been going: to Brenda's sister's event company, to her cousin's law firm, to the mysterious Prestige Greenery LLC. He showed them the inflated contracts, the no-bid awards, the sheer, breathtaking scale of her graft. The homeowners were horrified. People who had been fined hundreds of dollars for having the wrong color mailbox were now seeing that their money had been funding Brenda's family enterprise. The anger in the room was palpable. When a board member tried to stammer out a defense, claiming they knew nothing, the crowd shouted him down. At the end of the presentation, I stood up. I didn't talk about the raid or the arrest. I just said, for weeks, I was told that the rules were what kept this community special. It turns out, the rules were being used to manipulate and defraud all of you. This community is special not because of its covenants, but because of the people who live here. It's time for the people to take it back. The result was a complete rout. The entire board was forced to resign on the spot. A temporary committee was formed, led by my neighbor Arthur, the retired history teacher, whose quiet integrity had suddenly made him the most trusted man in the room. The community's law firm, Brenda's cousin's firm, was fired. A new reputable firm was hired, and they immediately began the process of clawing back the misappropriated funds and suing the vendors involved in the kickback schemes. The changes were immediate and profound. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. People started talking to each other again. The dreaded violation notices stopped. Someone put up a basketball hoop that was a vibrant, non-approved shade of neon green, and nobody said a word. It became a symbol of our liberation. Brenda's case moved through the legal system. Faced with an avalanche of evidence and the testimony of her hired thugs, who all took plea deals and rolled over on her, she had no choice but to plead guilty. She was sentenced to 4 years in a federal correctional facility for women. Her husband filed for divorce shortly after the sentencing. Her house was sold, and a nice young family moved in. They painted their front door a cheerful and technically non-compliant shade of yellow. Whispering Pines became, for the first time since I'd moved in, genuinely peaceful. The quiet I had sought wasn't about the absence of noise, but the absence of tyranny. I had wanted a tranquil place to retire from a life of fighting monsters, only to find one last monster lurking behind the manicured lawns and uniform mailboxes of suburbia. My methods were, admittedly, extreme. I didn't just win a dispute, I deployed a tactical operation to dismantle a person's life. But I sleep soundly at night. I look out my window at my quiet street, at Arthur tending his roses, at the kids playing with their neon green basketball hoop, and I feel a profound sense of satisfaction. I had to go to war to find my peace, but in the end, the peace I secured was not just for me, but for an entire community. And that's a victory worth every bit of the trouble. So, if you ever find yourself dealing with a power-tripping bully who thinks the rules don't apply to them, remember this story. Be patient, be methodical, gather your evidence, and never ever underestimate the lengths a cornered person with a fragile ego will go to, because eventually they will hand you the rope to hang them with. Thanks for sticking with me through this crazy ride.